The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. I'm Charles Christian and this is episode 31, the 30th of August edition of the Weird Tales Radio Show podcast, available on iTunes and all the usual podcast platforms. In this episode, we have the first in a new series of interviews on the theme of neo-paganism in North America, and we consider whether the United States is now the most pagan nation in the Western world. But first, as ever, here's Janie with news of our topical haunting. That's topical as in imminent.
And imminent it is, as the haunting takes place every year in just one day's time. That's the 31st of August. In a nearby town to us, in Suffolk, by the name of Beccles. So, the story is that during medieval times, the town was once overrun with rats. But 3 local men negotiated a deal with the town's corporation and guilds that, in exchange for a sum of money, they would rid the town of its rats. They did this by the time-honoured way of playing musical instruments, which so enchanted the rats that they followed the men out of town, across the marshes, down to the banks of the Waveney, the local river, where the rats all fell in the river and drowned. But, strangely, the 3 men never returned to claim their payment, and in fact, never seen again. The legend says the men sold their souls to a group of witches in exchange for the secret of enchanting the rats. But, as so often happens with demonic pacts in folklore, there was a catch. And soon as the rats had all been swept away by the waters of the river, the 3 men were swallowed up by the fires of hell. Their only respite from the internal damnation is once a year, on the 31st of August, their ghosts can be seen standing forlornly on the banks of the River Waveney. Yeah. Now, this is a curious legend because, though there's little doubt reports of towns being overrun with rats and then succumbing to outbreaks of bubonic plague, such as Black Death, which did decimate parts of East Anglia, they would have lingered long in the collective memory, of course. But it also seems to share elements of the well-known, that is, since the 14th century. We've got long memories around here. It's the well-known tale of the German Pied Piper of Hamelin. Sounds a bit similar, doesn't it? However, there is also an unpleasant incident in the town's actual historical record that may offer an explanation for the legend of the 3 burning men. So, it was during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor. She was the one that was otherwise known as Bloody Mary, when an attempt to restore the Roman Catholicism as the official religion of England saw the persecution of followers of the then new Protestant faith. Suffolk was not immune from the so-called Marian persecutions. And in 1556, 3 men, Thomas Spicer, John Denny and Edmund Poole, were all put to death by being burned at the stake in the old market square in Beccles. And perhaps this real-life tragedy became merged with accounts of the Black Death and the story of the Pied Piper. Maybe.
Yeah, that sounds plausible.
Yeah, so we've got our own little Pied Piper around here.
Yes.
Probably all over the world, actually. There's little Pied Pipers everywhere.
Yes.
Once a good story gets going.
Yeah, I'll replace the rat traps with I'll get myself a whistle and see if that works.
Well, I'm learning the ukulele, as you no doubt have heard.
Yes.
To your poor ears suffering chagrin. But, yeah, maybe that's it.
I haven't jumped in the river yet.
No, that's true. There's time yet. You should see what I'm working on at the moment. It's completely beyond my ability. Anyway. I'll let you know.
Lovely. Thank you. Our first neo-paganism interview is with Inanna Arthun, who has been active in the North American pagan community since 1982. She studied pastoral counseling at Harvard Divinity School and, among other things, she is currently a minister with the Unitarian Universalist Church in Massachusetts. Inanna, you are a minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church?
Well, let me clarify.
Yeah.
I am actually a lifelong pagan.
Right.
My ordination is with Society of Elder Faiths, which is a group here in Massachusetts, which has been recognized by the state and also by the federal government as a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and it can credential ministers with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I serve as the minister of a Unitarian Universalist church who knew when they interviewed me that I was an open pagan, and they thought that suited them just fine. They liked what I was able to offer them. I'm not technically a Unitarian minister. That gets into complicated notions of how the Unitarian Universalist Association in the United States recognizes and credentials ministers.
Right.
However, the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist denomination, has what's called congregational polity, which means that each individual congregation can make its own decisions and ordain its own ministers, hire whoever it likes. There's no control by the UUA over that. And I want to make that distinction really clear, because the UUA is very, I don't want them to wanting to think that I'm claiming to be a Unitarian minister. I serve a Unitarian church.
Right, okay. And you, I see you studied pastoral counseling at Harvard Divinity School, is that correct?
You're looking at my Facebook page. Yes. This is what happened. In 1994, I was invited by a pagan friend to speak at her Unitarian church because they were trying to get a CUPS group started. That's the Covenant of Unitarian Universalist Pagans. And she wanted me to come in and speak to the congregation, particularly about the pagan Sabbats and what pagans did. As a result of being connected with that church, I was doing guest services there, and I was part of what they called a ministry team because they didn't have a settled minister at that time. They had a team of laypersons that was doing their services on Sundays. And I decided I would go to divinity school and get a Master's of Divinity degree as a pagan. And eventually, I hoped, start my own pagan church. Mm-hmm. So I applied to Harvard Divinity School on the strength of my experience in the pagan community, what I'd done chiefly with the Earth Spirit community during the 80s and 90s. And they accepted me. So I got the Master's of Divinity degree, and that was what they call a terminal degree. You do not expect it to go on for a PhD if you get an MDiv. It's 3 solid years with 2 internships, one of which I did at a pagan center, and one of which I did with the Unitarian Church. And I did a thesis on the legalities of starting your own church in a minority religion. And one of the skills that I focused on was pastoral counseling, because the pagan community for years had been talking about the need to have formally trained clergy, and particularly in terms of people with real training in pastoral counseling so that you could handle things that came up as clergy, things that clergy in other churches were trained to know how to do. And then I also studied, there were 3, they called them ministerial skills, that administration was another one that I studied. But pastoral counseling was a tough one that I really focused hard on that. So that's why that shows up on my Facebook page.
Yeah. And when you say pastoral counseling, that's dealing with your community, helping them with bereavement and issues like that?
Yes, and one of the important things about pastoral counseling, aside from the fact that you deal more with spiritual issues specifically, is that you learn a lot about what you can't do. So you learn a lot about how to assess people's situation, emergency situation, how to refer people to services that they need, where they can get much more skilled help if they're suicidal, if they're in real crisis, and so on. So pastoral counseling is a lot of first level intervention type of counseling, but also it's people with spiritual crisis, people with spiritual questions. With the Unitarian Church, we get a lot more people coming in who are looking for money, who are in financial problems, because we're in a somewhat depressed area of the state of Massachusetts. But you do get people coming in asking questions, spiritual questions.
Right.
But for pagans found that people didn't want to go to a Christian minister, and they often mistrusted the psychiatric profession, because people who are involved in any kind of fringe community often find that they are marginalized by the psychiatric profession. Mm-hmm. And they found that people were leading these groups and were having things dumped in their lap that they simply they weren't prepared to handle effectively. And so pagans started talking about how important it was to get training in pastoral counseling.
Again, looking at the notes you sent me, you say you've been active in the pagan community since 1982. So can you just take me through how you first became involved? Did you sort of wake up one morning and say, that's it, I've had it with conventional religions? Or is it something you'd always been interested, or what? What was the sort of starting point on your journey?
Some people do the wake up one morning, and there are people who go to a pagan event, and the very common phrase you hear people say is, I feel like I've come home. I feel like I've found my family. I found my people. In my case, it was a little bit different. I sort of was born. I feel like I was probably born a pagan. I mean, as far back as I can remember, I was attracted to ancient pagan mythologies. I remember in grade school reading books about Greek mythology and also Mesoamerican mythology. There was a book in my elementary school library that had me absolutely mesmerized when I was in, say, 4th or 5th grade. And it was about the practices of the Aztecs and the Toltecs and so forth in pre-Columbian Central and South America. So that always interested me. And my family was not religious. I was very lucky in that sense that my family did not push any kind of religion. And so I was raised in the Unitarian Universalist Church. And I remember vividly in Sunday school at our UU church, them talking about, say, the myth of Persephone, the myth of Persephone going down in the winter and then coming back in the spring and so forth, yes. and have just vivid memories of the comparative religion that we were exposed to in UU Sunday school. UUs have no doctrine. They have no dogma. So I kind of bounced out of that. I got very involved in occultism, because that was the 1960s when the so-called occult explosion was happening. And I got very interested in magic working and astrology and the tarot. And by the time I was in college, when I was about 18, I read Hans Holzer's book, The New Pagans, which had just come out. I think it was like 1975 when that book was published. And it was at that point, that was sort of an overview of people who identified as pagans in the United States, different groups and different traditions. And that's when it hit me. I said that there's a name for this. There's other people who feel the way I do. I'm a pagan. It took me several more years, and I kind of went through what was then called the Aquarian Age. It hadn't been called the New Age. They called it the Aquarian Age, and participated in some discussion groups that met every week, and we talked about the Findhorn community in Scotland. I'm sure you know about that. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the movements that were coming up at that time. I met Deepak Chopra before he was a really big name, and I went to his seminars when they didn't cost a lot to do, and got to, you got to meet him up close and personal. And but at one of the as part of doing that, a new store opened up that was doing a lecture series, and one of the people they had come in and give a talk about witchcraft was Andres Corbin-Arthen of the Earth Spirit community. And that was in 1982. And I was talking to him after his talk, and he said, and I had heard about the pagan gatherings that were starting to form. Circle Network in 1981 did the first pagan spirit gathering, and they described it as, we're going to form a magical community for a whole week out in the wilderness. And I just found that fascinating. And Andres said, well, we're changing Rites of Spring, and the next Rites of Spring is like in 2 weeks, and you can still register it. And we went to PSG last year, and we're trying to follow that same model. So I was really excited, and that was practically in my backyard. And I went to Rites of Spring in 1982, scared to death, because I'd never met so many other people of my interests all at the same time, 60 or 70 of them all at the same time, at least. And I hung out with the Earth Spirit people for the rest of the summer, and then I formally joined their group, which at that time was called the Athenor Fellowship. I formally joined them in October of 1982. And that was where I really started getting very involved with the community.
Where in the sort of pagan family of religions does your beliefs fit in then?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a wide spectrum, and among the modern pagan community, and I think maybe this is more true in the United States than it is in Europe and in Britain, what we call Reconstructionism, that is authentically attempting to reconstruct a particular culture's beliefs and practices to the greatest extent that historical knowledge allows us to do. That is only one part of the American pagan community, and it's probably not the majority, although the groups that do this tend to be very well organized, and they really thought through what they do very carefully. What Earth Spirit did, what the Athenor Fellowship did, was what they called it at that time. They called it shamanic witchcraft, and it wasn't Wicca, it was witchcraft. And so we were doing practices that were common to various shamanic indigenous cultures, particularly tuned to what Andres felt was survivals of shamanistic practices in Europe, in Northern Europe. Well, he was Spanish, so is Spanish. So there was a lot of practices that he felt were remnants of shamanic practices in Europe that were not attached to any particular religious beliefs. And what we did was not particularly religious. It was focused on self-development and self-transformation of the self. And that, for me, was what attracted me to the group. That's the kind of work that I wanted to do. And as far as religious practices, people in the group varied, and that was very personal to people in the group. It wasn't necessarily something that we did as part of the group's practices. So I feel very strong affinity to gods and goddess energies without their being related to a particular historical pantheon. And I still have practices that I follow that are focused on the seasons and the movements of the planets and the stars and the phases of the moon. But I certainly I consider myself to be an emissary and an ally of Mother Goddess, is the way I put it. And that is something that's probably true for a lot of pagans, that if not all of them are theists at all, but if they are, it's less of a worship relationship than it is an active cooperative relationship, that we're here to do the God's work on earth. So that for me personally, I can't speak for everyone. I know a lot of people who do very serious Reconstructionist, or who do it's a version of Alexandrian Wicca, for example, where they are much more formal in their addressing to the gods and goddesses, and they're much more formal in the way that they have reconstructed. I know a number of them who have various types of reconstructed ancient Egyptian, whether that's Kemetic or another flavor of that. And their scholarship is daunting. They really know their stuff, but they truly believe it, and they have reconstructed some very ambitious rituals and Wheel of the Year practices in a way that is very impressive to see their dedication to it, the amount of knowledge that they apply to that.
Do you get a feel for what sort of numbers of people, either in Massachusetts or in the States generally, follow some form of paganism? I mean, is it tiny, 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 or is it probably a lot larger than most people imagine, but a lot of people aren't in the open about it?
Well, I unfortunately have not been as in touch with the pagan community as I once was. And I've gotten, in the last few years, I have been reawakening and reactivating a lot of my connections. But the sense that I have gotten is that compared with the, say, around 1990, 1993 or 92, when I left Earth Spirit, that a lot of pagans have gone semi-underground. Not that they are back in the broom closet, but they are being more discreet than at one point we thought we would be able to be. This makes quantifying them kind of difficult.
Yeah.
A lot of the internet has allowed a lot of people to connect on the internet, which is invisible to people who aren't part of those connections. It's really hard to count them. I know that some groups seem to have gotten smaller. I believe there are still there are still a lot of pagan gatherings happening. Many of them have moved into hotels, where it used to be a pagan gathering was people rented space out in the country. You had a campground. Everyone went out and they lived in the cabins, or they lived in the tents, and it was very rustic. Now, most of the big gatherings are sort of like science fiction conventions. Yeah. They are in a hotel and they rent function space. Yeah. They say, what I've heard, this figure that I've heard is there's maybe roughly 1 million people who practice some form of paganism, and that's all inclusive. I think that number may be a little low as far as estimates go. They say that it's growing fast. A lot of young people, millennials, are interested in it, and yet they are not interested in formal organizations. So there's a tremendous of what they call solitary practitioners. That's really getting to be a big group now. They're very hard to quantify that. How do you know that they're there unless they're, part of a Facebook group or something? The United States is still 80% Christian. That people, if you had pollsters say, so that the, paganism is in this tiny little itty bitty sliver called other on all the polls.
Yes.
So, it is hard to quantify. Even UUs are hard to quantify because they get stuck down in that little other in the polls. So we're very much a minority, and yet we feel like we're healthy. We're a healthy minority, and that we actually are growing, and that there's increasing interest and gradually increasing. I know you sent me the link about the military recognition of heathenism and Druidism, and Wicca had already been recognized by the military chaplain organization. So there's a slow acceptance, but there's been some backsliding, I feel, since some of the gains we made in PR in the 80s and early 90s, and the acceptance has sort of been trickling down very, very slowly into the consciousness. And I think younger people are coming up, just generally speaking, more aware of it and more accepting. But that doesn't mean that they follow the belief system themselves, just that they're familiar with it being around and they're not shocked by it.
Mm-hmm. In your work, when you're not doing your pastoral work, I mean, how is it? Are you within a church? Do you sort of hold regular meetings, or is it really just a case of you attend the Sabbats, the 8 of the year, or what if you like is the program? Obviously, you don't go to church on a Sunday, as Tina Turner sang, but what is it you would be doing?
Well, surprisingly enough, I am now our church is now almost entirely paganized, because what had happened, I mean, I've been there since 2013. What had happened is that the church had just gotten very, very small, which has happened to a lot of UU congregations, especially here in New England. There's every other town has a UU church, and they're all attached to their buildings. They don't want to give their buildings up. And so the churches many of them have not been able to bring new families or new people in. And then since I started with the church that I'm with, I seem to have done funerals for a lot of our old members. It's been very sad.
Yep.
And we got to the point where no one was coming on Sundays. And so just this spring, I said, I'm meeting everywhere I go. I am meeting people who notice my pendants, because I have a UU pendant and a pentacle, a 5-pointed star that I always wear, and remark that they are both pagans and UUs. Mm-hmm. It just was weird how often people were telling me that. So I said, why don't I just rework the church and start doing things on Sunday mornings? I'm calling them sacred circle meetings, where we would meet every Sunday, but it's a pagan meeting. And we'll eventually evolve that into a CUPS group, which is a formal part of the UUA, the Covenant of Unitarian Universalist Pagans. So that's what I'm building up right now. When I was with Earth Spirit, I had maybe 3 meetings a week at its peak, because I had my own group, because the Athanor was formed into, we called it a coven of covens. So I had my own group that I met with, and then I was made, for a while, I served on their Council of Elders, so the Council of Elders would meet. And then when I started working with training groups toward the end of my time there, then I had a training group that I was working with. So it would be three meetings a week. Many of the people that I know who have groups they belong to meet every week or every other week. Some of them just meet for the Sabbats. Mm-hmm. Some of them do the moon phases, which would be every other week, full moon and new moon. But then several years ago, I started going to open circles again, and I joined Society of Elder Face and have been, helping to organize as well as attending. And they do mostly the major Sabbats. They do Samhain, they do Lammas. They do a big thing at Lammas, Linasad. So that kind of got me going to open events more. Now, like I say, nowadays, a lot of people go to pagan pride events, and they may or may not go to many things, public things with other people. Very, very often there'll be, an occasional open circle, an occasional gathering, occasional pagan pride, which is usually in the September, and then they're solitary the rest of the time. And that's kind of the pattern. It's I'd like to see people meeting in more often. I'm trying to grow our group to get people to meet. I think every week is kind of if you're not doing it every week, you're not getting in the habit. It's not really becoming a habitual part of your life. And I think that's important. I think it's important for people to be connecting in person and to be meeting at least once a week, because that really makes it an essential part of your daily life. Less often than that, and it's too easy to just blow it off.
What are your plans for taking your ministry further forward?
Well, my immediate plans are, I'm really hoping that these sacred circle meetings at the church really do take off. I mean, basically, it's going to save the church. Yeah. And the people who are coming, the people who have started coming are very enthusiastic. And one of the things that's exciting about it is that right off the bat, we have families with young kids. That we've got 3 families coming with kids, and that's your lifeblood. And any religion, if the kids are coming, and I've actually told this story recently a couple of times to the people coming to the Sacred Circle, but back in 1982, 83, Jim Allen from Circle Network had come out to Rites of Spring, and I was sitting having conversation with him and some other people, and at that time, people in the pagan community mostly had not started having kids. We were a lot of 20s and 30-something people, sort of, pushing boundaries, and people were starting to form couples and so forth. And Jim Allen said, back in the 80s, he said, if we are not successful in passing our religion on to our children, our religion is going to die with us. This will just be a short-lived flash in the pan. And I'll always remember him saying that, because it was another 5 to 7 years before people started having children. Mm-hmm. And it made, I know it caused some problems in some groups, that people who did not have kids resented having the kids. I mean, that's always going to happen. And you see that happening in church. I mean, UU churches struggle with this. Yeah. The question of how do you integrate the kids into the congregation? What do you do with the people who don't like the kids? Or it can cause a lot of problems. I love kids. Bring them on. So I always remember that now the kids that were being born in the 80s and the 90s, they're now adults.
Yes.
They're all grown up, and they were raised pagan, and they're doing incredible, amazing things. They've just turned into these amazing people. And I look at these kids that I remember I was there when they were born, and I remember what Jim Allen said, and I just think, like, we did it. We're doing it. We're making, this is a generational thing now. This is a thing that will survive because it has become a family tradition, and the kids are sticking with it. That, to me, to have kids coming into the Sacred Circle meetings right away, when we did not have, so many UU churches do not have, they're aging, they're graying, they're aging out. That, to me, says there's something really healthy happening here, and looking to bring, the millennials, the younger generations in. It's like, come on in, we have something to offer you. It's not just what you can do for us. It's that we really have something to offer you. You can benefit by being part of this.
And are you finding the younger generation are also now wanting to become more actively involved, like you are, in a pastoral or leadership role? Well,
I think younger people are searching for what works for them. I'm not really in a position to evaluate that. I haven't seen a lot of leadership, a lot of impulses toward leadership coming up, because a lot of the younger people they're suspicious of hierarchy. They're more interested in very egalitarian and consensual frameworks where everyone has a say and you don't really have a leader. And in fact, with the Sacred Circle meetings, one of the ways I describe it is we all meet in a circle because in a circle, everyone is equal. Mm-hmm. So you want people who are expertise in meeting certain needs. But having expertise in meeting needs and being recognized for that is not the same thing as being a leader that people follow and look up to. I mean, you see, that's a fine distinction, but I think it's an important one. And I think younger people in particular are very aware of that distinction, that everyone is appreciated for their expertise and everyone's expertise is different, but you're not going to put anyone on a pedestal because of that. So the young people aren't aspiring for that pedestal, and they're not looking for people on that pedestal. There's a real shift in consciousness coming up there, I think.
But you're optimistic that, if you like, when our generation, your generation, are no longer so active, the movement will still continue.
I am optimistic, and maybe I'm an idiot, but yes, I am optimistic that it is going to continue and that we have built a really solid foundation, and we have literature and we have traditions, and that there are a lot of people who are very excited about this, and that they're feeling, back when the Aquarian age was getting going, there was a lot of talk about the Piscean age fading away, and that some of these, what they call the major religions, based on the Abrahamic religions based on the book, that those were just going to fade away as being part of the past, and that people are going to embrace new forms of spirituality. And I think that's happening, but it's been happening in the way that people on point often do. They're kind of out on their own, and the edges are all sort of frazzled. But it can come together. I feel it can come together, and that we really can have something that's new, and yet that draws on the traditions of the past. So you have that continuity with the past as well. People are very concerned about the environment. People are very concerned about the planet, and the paganism pretty much ties right into that very tightly.
Well, I think on that positive note, that's excellent. So, Inanna, thank you ever so much for your time. That was great.
Well, thank you. I was an honor to speak with you.
That's it. We're almost out of time, but there's just room to squeeze in one final story. But beware, it's a little bit icky. The Journal of Archaeological Science contains a report on a battery of forensic chemical tests that were carried out on a mummy in the Egyptian Museum in Turin. And these tests revealed that the ancient Egyptians had perfected the recipe for mummification far earlier than previously thought. Dr. Stephen Buckley, an archaeologist from the University of York, told the BBC News that this mummy literally embodies the embalming that was at the heart of Egyptian mummification for 4,000 years. Dr. Buckley and his colleagues worked on the chemical fingerprint of every ingredient, although each element could have come from a number of sources. The basic recipe was a plant oil, possibly sesame seed oil, a balsam-type plant or root extract that may have come from bulrushes, a plant-based gum, a natural sugar that may have been extracted from acacia, crucially, a conifer tree resin, which was probably pine resin, which when mixed into the oil would have given it an antibacterial property. Dr. Buckley began searching for the recipe several years ago when he and his team extracted and analysed the chemicals from Egyptian textiles that had been used to wrap mummies. The textiles are part of the Egyptian collection at the Bolton Museum in the north of England. Fabrics used to wrap Egyptian mummies provided the foundation for this study of ancient chemistry. Dating to around 4000 BC, these particular fabrics were much older than the point at which it was believed embalming and mummification originated. Explaining, Dr. Buckley said, mummification in general supposedly started around 2600 years BC, when the Great Pyramid was being built. But we observed there was evidence that the preservation of bodies started earlier than this. This discovery led the team to the prehistoric mummy in the Turin Museum collection. It had never undergone any conservation treatments, so it provided a unique opportunity to study unpolluted ancient Egyptian chemistry. Dr. Jana Jones, an Egyptologist and expert on Egyptian burial practices from the Macquarie University in Sydney, added, "The examination of the Turin body made a momentous contribution to our limited knowledge of the prehistoric period and the expansion of early mummification practice, as well as providing vital new information. By combining chemical analysis with visual examination, genetic investigations, radiocarbon dating, and microscopic analysis of the linen wrappings, we confirmed that this ritual mummification process took place around 3600 BC on a male aged between 20 and 30 years old when he died. The fact that the same recipe was used almost 2,000 years later to embalm the pharaohs, says Dr. Buckley, means its origins were much earlier than we thought. It also reveals an insight into how the ancient Egyptians perfected an antibacterial embalming recipe that protected and preserved their dead. Embalming was just one step in the process of preserving a body. The key steps were, and this is the yucky bit, the removal of the brain, possibly using a whisking process to cause the brain to liquefy, removal of the internal organs, putting the body into natural salt to dry it out, coating the body with the embalming recipe to kill bacteria and to seal it, wrapping the body in linen. It was the drying and embalming recipe that were the key to preservation, says Dr. Buckley. Egyptian mummification was at the heart of their culture. They believed the afterlife was just a continuation of life, but they needed the body to be preserved in order that the spirit had a place to reside. Probably best not to think too deeply about liquefying brains by whisking them after you turn out the light tonight. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or by email at urbanfantasist.icloud.com or on Twitter at Christian Uncut. Good night. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show.